DHEA sulfate declines during aging, and that's what we'll see here. On the y-axis, we've got circulating levels of DHEA sulfate, and on the x-axis, that's plotted against age. Now, average values for men in their 20s are around 8 micromolar, which is about 300 micrograms per deciliter. And then afterwards, we can see that age-related decline for DHEA sulfate. So why is this metabolite, why is DHEA sulfate important? So DHEA sulfate impacts many age-related outcomes, many of which are shown here. So DHEA sulfate is anti-osteoporotic, so it impacts bone health, obesity, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, the immune system, and the one that I'm most interested in, neuromodulation, in particular, neuroprotection. Now with that in mind, in my data over 22 tests, DHEA sulfate is unfortunately a weak spot, and that's what we'll see here. So this is 22 tests from 2022 to 2025 for circulating levels of DHEA sulfate. And then we can see that my average is 125 micrograms per deciliter or 3.4 micromolar. Now, if we plot that on the chart on the left, on the data on the left, that's where it would pop up, which is relatively low for my chronological age, and actually relatively low for any chronological age, and far from youthful. Now, the name of this channel is ConquerAging or Die Trying, not have age-expected biomarker values. So with that in mind, can I move DHEA sulfate towards youth? Now, I can already hear some of you saying, why don't you just supplement with DHEA, and that should raise your DHEA sulfate? But does that fix the problem? Now, sure, maybe taking DHEA as a supplement, maybe that does address some of the age-related outcomes that DHEA sulfate may impact. But if I haven't addressed the underlying mechanism for why it's low in the first place, maybe I'm not getting the maximum impact, and I'm interested in the maximum impact. So with that in mind, how can I move, or how can I potentially move DHEA sulfate values towards youth? So DHEA sulfate is derived from cholesterol. So starting from cholesterol, that's converted by 2 enzymatic steps into DHEA, and then DHEA is sulfated into DHEA sulfate. So this seems pretty straightforward. If I increase plasma levels of cholesterol, can I increase DHEA sulfate? Seems pretty straightforward. But note that cholesterol is a broad term. Does this apply to HDL, VLDL, lipoprotein A, LDL? And note that IDL, intermediate density lipoprotein, isn't on the list, but that's a very minor fraction of total cholesterol. Now, during those 22 tests for measuring DHEA sulfate, I've also measured plasma levels of cholesterol. So I can look at correlations between the two, DHEA sulfate, which each of these lipoproteins. So maybe one of them or some of them are associated with higher or even lower DHEA sulfate. So with that in mind, correlations with DHEA sulfate for lipoproteins, HDL, and I'm only going to focus on the p-values here. So greater than 0.05 is not statistically significant. HDL's correlation with DHEA sulfate is not statistically significant as its p-value is 0.12. Similarly, VLDL's p-value is 0.63, not significant. And lipoprotein A's p-value for its correlation with DHEA sulfate, also not significant as it's 0.28. But note for lipoprotein A, I only have data for 10 tests. I'm planning on measuring that more often going forward, including the next test coming up in a couple weeks. But nonetheless, none of these 3 lipoproteins are significantly correlated with DHEA sulfate. But what about LDL? And actually here, we can see a significant positive correlation for LDL with DHEA sulfate. So first on the y-axis, we've got DHEA sulfate, and that's plotted against LDL on the x. And then we can see that significant positive correlation. And note, the correlation coefficient here, the lowercase r, is 0.74. That's considered a strong correlation because anything greater than 0.7 is considered strong. So this is a significant correlation for LDL with DHEA sulfate. In other words, when my LDL has been relatively higher, that's significantly correlated with higher DHEA sulfate. And conversely, when my LDL has been lower, that's significantly correlated with DHEA sulfate towards the lower end of my range. But there's more to this story, because if I just simply increase LDL to increase DHEA sulfate, I'll potentially also increase ApoB, which is a marker of heart disease risk. So I'll potentially increase my cardiovascular disease risk if I try to increase LDL too high with the goal of increasing DHEA sulfate. But this may not be the mechanism for why DHEA sulfate declines during aging or is relatively age expected in my data. That's potentially because when LDL is low in youth, and that's at a time when DHEA sulfate is high, which is what we'll see here, with average LDL values on the y-axis plotted against age on the x. And here we can see that in youth, so in 18-year-olds, average LDL values are around 85 for men in green, and women, it's about 93. Average values for women are around 93. So in youth, in 18-year-olds, LDL is relatively low, but DHEA sulfate is relatively high. So if this was a low cholesterol, low DHEA sulfate story, as we potentially see in my case, that's not what the published data for how LDL looks in youth at a time when DHEA sulfate is at its highest. So just playing this out a bit further, LDL then peaks in midlife for both men in green, again, men in green, and women in red. And during that time, that's not at a time when DHEA sulfate is at its highest level. So higher LDL, maybe higher DHEA sulfate. In fact, DHEA sulfate is even lower than in 18-year-olds. And playing this out further, LDL then declines towards end of life. And if we extrapolated that out past 88 years, it further declines. And that's at a time when DHEA sulfate is at its lowest. So when considering that LDL is low in youth at a time when DHEA sulfate is high, this argues against this idea of raising LDL to raise DHEA sulfate. But there's also another reason why DHEA synthesis from cholesterol may not be the limiting factor. And that's because DHEA sulfate isn't just formed from DHEA. DHEA is also used to make testosterone. So if DHEA is low, and correspondingly DHEA sulfate will be low, I'd also expect testosterone to be low. Now, I haven't measured testosterone at every test, but we can evaluate if testosterone is also relatively low during those tests when I measured DHEA sulfate at the same time. So I did that for 4 tests from October of 2023 through May of 2024. So during that 8-month period, I tested 4 times. And during that time, DHEA sulfate was again around age expected, not youthful. But testosterone was higher than expected based on chronological age. And this isn't an abnormality. My testosterone data is generally around 900 nanograms per deciliter, and I'm not on TRT. This is all natural testosterone, no exogenous agents. So these data argue against synthesis from cholesterol being a problem in my case, which then raises a question, maybe DHEA sulfate isn't a question of reduced synthesis during aging, maybe it's increased degradation. So what can degrade DHEA sulfate? Gut bacteria is one potential option because they contain genes that can degrade DHEA sulfate. One of them is shown here, and it's K01138, and this is an uncharacterized sulfatase. And then you can see the EC number 3.1.6 Now, that may seem like a lot of just words and numbers and nonsense, but the amount of this gene, this gut bacterial gene, which is a sulfatase, which removes sulfate groups, was compared in 67-year-olds versus 97-year-olds. And before getting into that data, let's just identify which potential bacterial proteins are in this EC 3.1.6 because you can see that there's a dash there. That means that there are many proteins that can fall under this enzyme class. So I looked that up, and the following genes or the following enzymes, the following proteins correspond to this EC number. And note 3.1.6.2 is sterile sulfatase. So K01138 can encode a sterile sulfatase. So what reaction does that catalyze? Well, as we can see here, DHEA sulfate plus water, so this is hydrolysis, ends up in, or degrades DHEA sulfate into DHEA plus sulfate. In other words, 3.1.6.2, this gut bacterial gene, or encodes the protein that degrades DHEA sulfate into DHEA plus sulfate. So it degrades DHEA sulfate. Now, with that in mind, older people who are 97 years old in this study had 3 times higher levels of this gut bacterial protein that could potentially degrade DHEA sulfate relative to 67-year-olds. Now, having higher levels of genes, gut bacterial genes, is one thing, but What about the actual metabolites? That's the story of what is happening, where the genes are a story of what can happen. So they actually looked at that in the study and note that the genes were significantly different. The p-value and FDR were less than 0.05. So anyway, they also looked at the metabolite levels, so DHEA sulfate levels, plasma levels, for 97 versus 67-year-olds as shown there. And here, there was a 60% reduction for the 97-year-olds relative to the 67-year-olds for DHEA sulfate. So lower plasma levels of DHEA sulfate in conjunction with having 3x higher levels of a gut bacterial gene that encodes a protein that can degrade DHEA sulfate. Now, I'm not saying this is causation, this is association, but it suggests that gut bacteria could be a part of this story where their proteins are degrading DHEA sulfate at a greater prevalence during aging. So with that in mind, I haven't tracked my gut microbiome. I don't have that data. I've tracked it a few times. I've only tracked it 3 times, I think, in 10 years. But I have been tracking metabolites. And some of those metabolites include gut bacterial metabolites that may provide insight into how I could potentially reduce or improve conditions in the gut to maximize systemic levels of DHEA sulfate. So are gut bacterial metabolites associated with DHEA sulfate? And how I've been able to track gut bacterial metabolites, or some, is because I've been using at-home metabolomics. I've now done this 18 times using Iolo's kit, which includes more than 600 metabolites, including indoxyl sulfate. So if you want to use this kit on your own, there's a discount link in the video's description. And I'll have more videos on data from this kit, metabolites from this kit, including kynurenine and tryptophan, and its link with neurodegeneration coming up in a future video. So indoxyl sulfate is a gut bacterial metabolite for those who don't already know. And before going into that story, I'm going to give away, the big picture, which is that higher levels of this gut bacterial metabolite, indoxyl sulfate, are significantly correlated with lower DHEA sulfate. That's coming in a minute, but let's introduce how indoxyl sulfate is a gut bacteria-derived metabolite, which is what we'll see here. So starting off from the colon or large intestine, and more specifically in the gut lumen. This is the inside of the tube, the inside of the large intestine. So proteins that escape absorption into the small intestine and that make their way into the large intestine are then degraded into amino acids, in particular, one of them being tryptophan. Tryptophan is then converted by gut bacteria into indole. Indole then makes its way by the portal circulation to the liver, where the liver then sulfates it to produce the metabolite indoxyl sulfate. So from this, we can see that indoxyl sulfate is a gut bacteria-derived metabolite. And then let's take a look at the data for higher levels of this gut bacteria-derived metabolite being correlated with DHEA sulfate, which is what we'll see here. So on the y-axis, we've got DHEA sulfate, and this is plotted against circulating levels of indoxyl sulfate. And then, again, this is 18 tests, metabolomic data for indoxyl sulfate, venipuncture data for DHEA sulfate. So I measured them on the same day of testing. Here we can see that significant inverse correlation. In other words, when my plasma levels of indoxyl sulfate, this gut bacteria metabolite, are at their highest, that's significantly correlated with my lowest DHEA sulfate. And on the other hand, when my plasma levels of this gut bacteria metabolite were at their lowest, that was significantly correlated with my highest levels of DHEA sulfate. Which then raises the question, if I can decrease my circulating levels of this gut bacteria metabolite to less than 1 micromolar, which would be a new low for me, can I push DHEA sulfate more consistently to its highest level, somewhere around 140? Now note that I was able to get to 140 for one data point, data in black, but this is an infrequent and rare occurrence as my average is around 125. Now, 140 is still not 300, but it's movement in the right direction. And if the best that I can do is resist age-related change going forward, that's a small win. Now, granted, it's not complete rejuvenation and going completely towards youth, but this is one step in the chain, and I plan on investigating this indefinitely for the next decades. So hopefully I can take more steps to help push it closer to youthful values relative to age expected. But also, this is just one metabolite, and actually indoxyl sulfate was one of the top and strongest correlations for either lower DHEA sulfate or higher DHEA sulfate. And there's a long list of metabolites that were significantly correlated with both positively and negatively. So if you're interested in seeing that full list, it's currently on Patreon in the correlations tier. But this is just an observation. So what? I see plasma levels of indoxyl sulfate correlated with DHEA sulfate. But how can I move the needle? How can I decrease levels of, or can I decrease levels of indoxyl sulfate? So is diet associated with this gut bacterial metabolite? And rather than using studies in other people, because I track diet, and I've done that since 2015, I can look at correlations from my diet with circulating levels of indoxyl sulfate. And there, we're going to see, or here, we're going to see that coconut butter is inversely correlated with indoxyl sulfate. So this isn't coconut oil, this is coconut butter, which is closer to the whole food. So on the y-axis, we've got plasma levels of indoxyl sulfate. And then on the X, we've got my average daily coconut butter intake. So for those who don't know, as I mentioned, I've tracked diet since 2015 every day with a food scale. I then enter that data into Chronometer, which is a diet tracking app. I then take that data and put it into a spreadsheet. Now, for every blood test, say if there's 50 days in between blood tests, because I'm tracking diet every day, I take the average dietary intake for that 50-day period and then line it up with the blood test results. So every blood test has a corresponding average dietary intake, and then with enough data for blood tests, correspondingly tracked diet data, I can look at correlations. Now, this isn't causation, but it does give me insight into what may be able to move the needle. So in this case, we can see that coconut butter is significantly inversely correlated with indoxyl sulfate. So when coconut butter is at my lowest intakes, so less than around 3 grams per day, that's significantly correlated with my highest intakes of indoxyl sulfate. And on the other hand, when my coconut butter intakes have been around 22 grams per day, an average of 22 grams per day, that's significantly correlated with my lowest levels of indoxyl sulfate. So if the goal is to reduce indoxyl sulfate to potentially increase DHEA sulfate, what will happen if I push this out a bit further to 25 grams or more? And I have no data. As you can see, I have no data in the 25 gram per day range. Now, with that in mind, my average coconut butter intake since the last test, which was on May 27th, is currently 26 grams per day. So I'll be able to generate that data for the next test, and we can directly test this hypothesis. But why don't I just look at correlations for coconut butter or other aspects of diet with DHEA sulfate? That would be the most straightforward way, wouldn't it? So I do that. And again, those correlations are on the correlation tier on Patreon. There aren't very many strong correlations for whatever reason, which potentially could suggest that diet isn't directly associated with DHEA sulfate, but based on the hypothesis that I presented here in this video, maybe this is a mediating effect through the gut, where diet has to affect the gut, and note, has to affect the gut before it can impact DHEA sulfate. That's the road I'm going to take. Whether or not it'll work, we'll find out. Now, with that in mind, that the diet correlations with DHEA sulfate directly, there aren't a lot of strong correlations there relative to the metabolomic data where I looked at indoxyl sulfate versus DHEA sulfate. That's within the 2 to 22 gram per day range for coconut butter. There too, I don't have data at 25 grams or more. Now, I should say coconut butter, when looking at 27 standard clinical chemistry biomarkers, so albumin, creatinine, blood urea nitrogen, lymphocytes, etc., coconut butter has a net negative correlative score with 27 biomarkers. So I don't want to go too high for coconut butter. With that in mind, my coconut butter range is around, the higher end is about 50 grams per day. So 25 grams per day is still relatively high, but it's not anywhere close to my highest, which may be bad for more biomarkers than not. Now, if you're interested in seeing the full correlation list for diet versus indoxyl sulfate, that too is on the correlations tier on Patreon. So if you're interested in that, check it out. So to sum it all up, will increasing coconut butter decrease indoxyl sulfate and increase DHEA sulfate? Test number 5 for metabolomics and all of the other tests that I do or that I've done this year is scheduled for just a couple of weeks away for July 22nd. So stay tuned for that data in an upcoming video. If you've ever wondered what's optimal for biomarkers, well, I have a new Patreon tier dedicated just to that. It currently includes the 33 biomarkers that are shown here, with more than 2 hours of video content, 48 published references, all of which is on this new Patreon tier. Now note that these aren't the reference ranges, in fact far from it, which is not intended to tell us what's optimal for aging and minimizing risk of disease and for potentially maximizing longevity. I've done all the legwork on that, looking at as many studies as possible to collate this data or these data into one place. So again, if you're interested in that, check it out. And before you go, if you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon. where I post at least twice a day in 5 Patreon tiers. We've also got a whole bunch of discount and affiliate links that you can use to test yourself that help support the channel, including ultralabtest.com, which is where I get the majority of my blood tests done, including DHEA sulfate, the clearly filtered water filter, which I use every day, at-home metabolomics, as I mentioned in the video, oral microbiome composition, NAD testing with Ginfinity, epigenetic testing with True Diagnostic, Cyfox Health for the DNA methylation test GrimAge and other blood biomarker tests, green tea, which I drink every day, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got new merch, including merch that I just posted today. Data is my North Star, which is 100% true. This is how I live. And then we've also got other new merch, including Figuring Stuff Out Is My Drug and the ConquerAging or Diet Trying channel logo. So if you're interested in all of that, there's a link in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.